Hey guys, today we're going to be making a moonstone ring. Right here we are wrapping that bezel wire around the stone and making sure that it's nice and snug. I don't like to have a lot of space around my stone just because it can make it hard to set later. Then just cutting that. I am annealing it here. It was a little springy, so like if it's doesn't like really stay, if it kind of like springs, and if you heat it up and cool it back down, it makes it a lot easier to work with. Just making sure that bezel wire is nice and snug against the stone, and there was quite a bit of space, so I did cut that down a little bit. And then I'm just making sure that it meets up and putting a little bit of borax and water as my flux, and I use easy solder, so that's what I'm using here. And my torch is an acetylene torch. And then quenching it, I use pH down and water as my pickle. And just making sure that stone fits in there nice and snug. And it does. Maybe a little too snug now, but it's all right. There's a little bit of dirt from the solder block in there, like charcoal in there. So that's what I was scraping off. And I do like to turn my stones upside down and push the bezel wire against it that way. And makes it just a little bit snugger fit, basically. And here I am just cleaning off the silver. The solder won't flow, so I can't solder the two pieces together if the silver is not clean. You can, but it just makes it a lot easier to make sure that it's just clean to start with. I find that it causes a lot of problems if you don't clean it. So here I'm just heating up from below and on top, just making sure that whole part is nice and heated up enough so that solder will flow. I really should have cut this piece of silver down before doing that. I didn't need to have that much extra silver. I didn't really know what design I wanted to do, so that's kind of one reason I left it. And I did snip it in between that frame and this frame. And here I'm just doing some design work. I didn't know the design I was doing, so I was just playing around with it. And I did speed it up quite a bit, so that way you guys don't have to sit through it going quite as slow, because I really didn't have a design. But I wanted you guys to kind of see that design process, like where there's just playing around with it until I've kind of got something that I liked. Like I was going to do the three little guys, and I end up doing two and moving one of them down. As you can see here, I'm starting to mess with that a little bit and see and I kind of like that design a little bit better. So, and I'm just bending that wire to form it in a way that I like it. There's no like rhyme or reason to it, really. I just kind of bend it until I bend it to where I like it. And here I'm just putting some flux on it, and I'm going to solder that down. So as you can see here, it does the whole turn white and then turns black, and then it makes it so you can move it around a lot easier. Sometimes I'm a little impatient and kind of get in there before I should. It kind of turns like a liquidy, and that's when you can kind of move it around a little bit better, and it's not so sticky. You'd think by now I would have learned, but I haven't. And just using that easy solder again and just tapping it down. I decided I'd do some little balls here, so I'm just kind of playing around with that and seeing if I like it. And I do, so I'm going to solder that down. I did replace that little ball because it was a little too small. There we go. We finally got it. Finally found one that we liked. So we're just soldering that down. It's going to turn white, it's going to turn black, and then it doesn't really show up so much in the videos, but it does turn kind of a liquidy kind of color. And you can also cut your solder and do that. And then it kind of just flows when it's hot enough. That's kind of an easier way, I think, for beginners. Taking that and quenching it. And here we are making a leaf. Or a feather, whatever you want to call them. I call them leaves, but they could definitely be feathers too. And I'm just sanding that down so the silver will solder to it, because I'm going to put a little strip of solder on it to give it more of that leaf effect or feather effect, either one. What are your guys' votes? Do you think they're leaves or feathers? I think they look more like leaves, but... And I do make these guys out of just scrap silver. I'm just kind of bending it to where I want it. The look that I like. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to bend it also, so it doesn't really matter. You do want to be careful with the heat on this. You don't want to add too much heat to that little stem part that I'm soldering onto it. And you do want to tap on the top of that little stem and it'll flow down. That's one thing that I have learned. That works the best. If you put too much heat on it, like the bottom here, you can kind of see it kind of melted up. It does that if you put too much heat on it. Thankfully, it didn't do it too bad, so I can still use this one. Sometimes I like the effect that it gives too. And then I just bend that silver back and forth, and it makes it look like a leaf or a feather. And next, we're going to solder that down. So one thing that I like to do is put some solder on the back of the leaf, and that will kind of just flow down onto whatever I'm working on. I like doing that because then it's kind of wherever it's touching, it's going to solder to it. Makes it a little bit easier. So before I was just making sure that's where I wanted it, that it fit, that kind of thing. I did put a little bit more solder there, and then at the tip over here because it wasn't soldering down all the way. And those are the most important parts, to make sure that they are definitely soldered down, because if they come up, then it's gonna snag on stuff, and that's not fun. And here I'm making up some little balls so I can do some more design work. So I'm gonna cut those up here, and then all you really do is apply heat to it, and the silver will naturally ball up. It's kind of a cool little process. So you just put heat to it and they ball right up. And I'm still just playing around with the design because I didn't really have any design in mind for this. In my opinion, it was a little too much. I liked the look of it, but I just felt like it was a little too much. So I did end up removing some of them and kind of moving them around a little bit. Until I just play with stuff until I kind of like how it's turning out, and then I just solder it down. You want to be careful not to use too much solder because then it just makes it super messy, obviously. Sometimes cutting little pieces of solder and putting it next to it for people beginning really makes it a lot easier. I'll try doing that in another video so you guys can see a little bit better what I'm talking about. When you're placing the balls on, you want to make sure that when you go to solder down that it doesn't solder too close to that bezel wire, that wire that wraps around the stone. Because if you do, what will happen is it'll make it really hard to actually push that bezel wire over the stone. So that's why I'm kind of adjusting them and moving them around like I am, because I want to make sure that one isn't going to be too close to the stone. And I do have to move my phone back because if I keep my phone too close, it overheats, and we don't need to have to get a new phone because that's not fun. Just pushing all that around, making it where I like it, and then just soldering it down. And these are the last little elements of the design that we're going to be doing on it. So next we're going to be cutting it out and cleaning it up a little bit. I hate using the little hand saws, so I always just use snips. It's just my personal preference. And I do save all the silver, so nothing goes to waste. I do save everything and reuse it. I'm just cutting away some of that excess silver. And like I said, I do save those little scraps, and I'll make little balls out of the little scraps. And then the bigger ones, I'll either melt down and make new back sheets out of them, or I will clean them up and use them as leaves. You can adjust a little tip there, and it'll either make it so it's easier to take off or harder to take off. I didn't know that for a long time, so I hope that helps someone that might not know that either. Just playing with different little bits to see what will get in there the best way that I like. Sometimes you have to play with different things to see what works best for you. Just because I do something a certain way doesn't mean that's going to be the best way for you to do it. It's just the way that works best for me. So just keep that in mind. Just because I'm doing it a certain way doesn't mean you have to too. Just wrapping the wire around the mandrel. This isn't a specific, like a custom order or anything like that, so I'm just making this to make it. So I'm not making it a specific size or anything like that. I'm just making it a random size. Usually I try to make things around like a 6 or a 7 because I feel like those are kind of sizes that fit most people. And it is easier to make them bigger, so if someone needs it a little bit bigger, I can do that also. But it is harder to make them smaller. And then I do like to put the little ring on and then figure out where I like it and then use that silver to scratch it. I find that it leaves a little mark and it kind of shows where to line it up. I'm just moving my phone back so it doesn't melt it. You want to make sure not to get that band too hot at the top because it can melt it too. So you want to be really careful. Try to direct the heat directly towards where you're soldering. And I do like to let it sit for a minute. This is a little sped up, so I know you can't really tell as much. But I did let it sit for a few minutes so that way that solder has enough time to harden up. And I didn't like how it was sitting, so I did actually move it around. The only reason I'm using this honeycomb soldering block is because my soldering block right now is so damaged. I mean, I need to make a new one. It's so like worn and used that it's like almost doesn't have any flat spots. So I'm just using this honeycomb because it actually is flat. That's the only reason I'm using it. And I'm being really, really careful here and just trying to move it a little bit without hopefully melting or breaking anything. It's always best, obviously, if you can do it right the first time, but that doesn't always happen. And I always like to sand down on that middle part there because it can get really, really sharp. You are working with metal that's been cut, so it does make it really sharp. So I always try to sand that down so it's comfortable and not hurting anyone. And it was making it kind of hard to tell what size it was and stuff like that. And if it was sitting right because it was scratchy. I didn't exactly like how it was sitting, so I did decide to readjust it again. So, and I'm doing it a little bit of a different way this time because that holds it straight, and then I can just kind of adjust it. You have to be really careful doing this too. A lot can go wrong real fast. And like I said before, you do want to let it sit for a second and kind of harden up. And this is sped up, so it doesn't look like it's sitting as long as it is. I always like to do things a little backwards sometimes, and I kind of stamp after the 925 after, so it's kind of more in the middle, and I know that it's correct, and it's like a spot I'm actually going to be using it. I don't know, that's just how I do it. I know it's backwards. And here I'm just pounding the silver back because it kind of came in quite a bit where it's the 925, and that can kind of make it sit kind of wonky. And then I'm going to throw it in the tumbler and let it clean that way, and then I'm going to use liver of sulfur, which I use, you can see here, it is out of the tumbler. So I cleaned it, I put liver of sulfur on it, and I did actually throw it back in the tumbler. I guess I didn't film that process, sorry about that. So I put it in the tumbler, I let it clean, and then I took it out of the tumbler, I put liver of sulfur in it, and then I did put it back in the tumbler. I didn't really need to do all that, though, because I am going to end up polishing it anyway, so I don't know. Sometimes I just do that, but... and then here, I'm just going to move that leaf out of the way a little bit so it I can't get the stone in because it's kind of covering it a little too much. And this is a kind of a tight fit for this stone. So I'm just kind of working with that a little bit here. And I did push the bezel out a little bit so it did fit, the stone fit in a little bit easier as well. And then I'm just pushing that bezel wire back in using whatever tools I can get my hands on to push it in. I like this one because you can really get under that leaf and push it in. I don't push it in all the way under the leaf, so that I do just kind of leave what's behind the leaf that I can't reach. I just leave that because the leaf is holding it down, and also on the sides of the, on the rest of it's holding it down, so it doesn't really need it. And then I'm just going around and cleaning up any marks that were left on it from pushing that bezel wire in and out and all that kind of stuff. And just cleaning it up. And so the polishing compound I used on this is called Fabuluster. So I'm just going around and making sure that I'm getting it all nice and shiny. This ring will also be available on my website, which is brandedandwild.com, along with the rest of my jewelry I have available. I don't think this one will last long, though. It turned out really pretty. Look how gorgeous that is. And once again, you can find this over on brandedandwild.com.